So I want to commend you for making it to our final session. We're going to wrap everything up on how to navigate the pastor's soul care. And I'm grateful that you've taken the time to be a part of this with us. I am convinced that this is the key to staying in the ministry a long time and to experience the joy that we hope to experience, to be able to embrace the calling that God has on our lives, to care for God's flock. 1 Peter chapter 5 emphasizes that the call of God from a pastor is to shepherd the flock of God that is among you, and to do so on behalf of the chief shepherd. I would argue there's no greater privilege than to be able to care for God's people on behalf of the chief shepherd, as we've been called to do. But as we've established throughout these sessions, there's a cost. There's a price that comes with the work that God has called us to. Paul writes to the Corinthians in 2 Corinthians chapter 4. He talks about this dying that takes place as a result of his ministry. He even says to them at one point, death in us, life in you. There's a special death that seems to come to the pastor. And when we struggle in our souls, we recognize the reality of that, the uniqueness of it, which is why we have to make the efforts that we've been talking about to care for our own souls so that we can not just survive, but thrive in the ministry that God has called us to. I'd like to take our eyes back to the umbrella passage that we referred to it as in Acts 20, verse 28. Pay careful attention to yourselves and to all the flock in which the Holy Spirit has made you overseers, to care for the church of God, which he obtained with his own blood. I know that after my departure, fierce wolves will come in among you, not sparing the flock, and from among your own selves will arise men speaking twisted things to draw away the disciples after them. That verse 28, and then the two verses that follow, show the reason why that calling is there. Verse 28 says, pay careful attention to yourselves and all the flock. And oftentimes in pastoral ministry, we love to focus on paying careful attention to the flock. We know that's a big part of the call of the ministry. But we've been trying to emphasize through these sessions that it's just as important for each of us as pastors to realize we must pay careful attention to ourselves as much as we pay careful attention to the flock. So there are two final questions I'd like us to consider for our time. The first is, how have you grown in self-awareness about these topics we discussed? In other words, have you become more aware of what's going on in your own soul that's brought a greater knowledge of these things, and it's helped you to know how to act on them? The second question is, how are you going to act? How are you going to respond to the things you've learned, the things that God, by the power of his Holy Spirit, has revealed to you? Are you going to take courage and step into some really hard things that will require courage for you to do so? So think about those two questions, because we talked about calling. We talked about the call, that this is about life and doctrine. What did you grow aware of when we started talking about not just what you believe, but how you live your life and why that matters, why that's a part of this call of the pastor to not just care for the flock, but to keep watch over your life and the things that you believe. We talked about soul care of a pastor. We talked about the work of a pastor has to do for his own soul. And that pointed specifically to our humanity, our weaknesses, our limitations that we have to embrace. Not just because we're weak, because we are, but because it's specifically how God enhances our ministry. What did you learn about yourself in thinking about and being challenged about embracing your own humanity? And how well you do that? And are you going to act on that? Are you just going to continue to try to act superhuman in your ministry? Or are you actually going to, with courage, embrace your limitations? Realizing you're not God, you're just a man, and you're weak and needy and a sinner, and you need Jesus just like everybody else. If you embrace that, your ministry will radically change for the good. What about when we talked about being cared for spiritually by others? I shared about my mentor, Jackson. I wondered, did you long for having an older pastor in that moment to be able to go to talk to be able to pour your heart out to in the midst of the difficulties? What did you grow aware of as I talked about the mentoring aspect and the need for others to care for us, that we can't just care for ourselves, we have to receive the care of others? Then we started talking about how to care for ourselves physically. I want to remind you that our bodies are a big part of what we do in the ministry, not because this is the instrument, the one instrument God's given us to do this work. But there is so much in the wholeness of our humanity that we have to look at to see what's going on in our soul. We talked about how and why we eat. We talked about how much sleep we get. We talked about exercise. We talked about resting and taking a day off and letting go of the ministry burdens. I want to ask you, what did you grow aware of in your own life? How did the Lord convict you specifically in regard to how you're caring for your physical body in regard to these different aspects of rest and sleep and exercise and those things? And here's the area I really want to challenge you to think about how you're going to respond to that. Are you going to change in the patterns? Are you going to prioritize the things you now need to do in your life to be healthier physically, to care for your body in a way maybe you have neglected to care for up to this particular point? We talked about friendship and how crucial that is. And I wonder if you longed for that friend you don't have, that you wish you had. Were you growing aware of that friendship you want, but you don't know where to find them? Are you going to go seek them now? Are you going to pray and ask God to try to provide that friend in your life, whether it's another pastor down the road or whether it's a friend in the community or maybe somebody in the church that wants to be your friend and to support you and care for you? We talked about silence and solitude and being still. Remember, being productive doesn't mean you have to be busy and going and moving all the time. Think about what you grew aware of as you heard me tell my story, my own story of how I hated silence and how God was at work in my life to slow me down, to make me still, and to see the benefit of silence and solitude. What was that for you? And how are you going to respond to that call to prioritize that aspect of your life? I certainly hope you grew aware of how much the darkness of the soul may be affecting you in ways you didn't realize, even until we talked about depression and anxiety and even suicide. How are you going to respond to that? Are you going to reach out for help? Maybe you already have reached out for help, and if you have, I commend you. If you haven't, I want to encourage you to reach out for help, because that is one of the crucial aspects to care for ourselves, to care for our own soul in the midst of all of this. So Acts 20, verse 28, is the core of the call of a pastor. And though there is a clear call to care for the flock that God has given us, and the Apostle Peter affirms that in 1 Peter 5 as well, I want to emphasize the urgency of the other part of this call that gets so neglected so often, and that is the care of your own soul. To pay careful attention to yourself, your own walk with Jesus, your own pursuit of His Word, your own pursuit to walk with Him, but your also pursuit of caring for yourself physically, mentally, to begin to feel and care for yourself emotionally, as well as to care for yourself spiritually, to find support from others. You cannot do this work alone, that you need to pull others in. There is an urgency for you to embrace this, which is why I want to challenge you to not only be aware of what has come up for you in your own soul as we walk through this material, but how has God emboldened you to give you courage to do something different, to act, to respond in a way that will be a benefit to you and your soul. Because I assure you, if you respond to this call, this challenge, you will find a freedom in your soul to do the work of the ministry in a way you have not had. That you will find a joy and a love and appreciation for the work you get to do that maybe is gone. And the other thing I think you will find is that you will thrive in the work you do, not just survive. And you will be able to thrive a long time in doing it. Because that's really the goal. We started this time together talking about the burnout rates and the amount of pastors who can't stay in the ministry. But my hope and prayer for you as a result of all of this, as you challenge yourself to respond and take courage in what you're supposed to do now, is that you would have a long, fruitful ministry as a result of it. My final encouragement to you is this: reach out for help. Whether it's a pastor friend that you have, whether it's somebody in your church, maybe it's a professional counselor in your community, maybe it's a ministry that you need to reach out to. Whatever it is, start there. Act in that way. Reach out for help so you can talk to somebody in a safe, open, honest place so they can know where you are. If you have nowhere to start, my encouragement to you would be to go to the Focused Pastor and start there. There's a pastoral care hotline that you can contact through the website there. Start there and reach out to try to talk to somebody about what it is you're battling, whatever God has revealed to you in regard to going through this time together. I'm convinced that God has called us not just to serve as pastors, to preach His word and to shepherd His people, but I believe it's part of God's design that we thrive in this work that He's called us to. I believe it's His design that we enjoy this work. There's a special joy that comes with being able to be a pastor and to serve in this way. And I believe it's part of God's design that we're able to do this as long as He calls us to be able to do it. So focus on caring for your own soul. And I believe that that truly is the way to be able to have a joyful, long ministry that He calls you to.